Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another bookish video. And today I'm excited to run through all the books that I read in September, share my thoughts and feelings with you, let you know if I would recommend. And because it's now fall, you can rest easy in the knowledge that most of these books that I'm going to talk about are spooky, cozy, or dark in some way or other. So if that's your vibe, if you love to read cozy, spooky books in the fall as much as I do, this is the video for you. Also, for the first time in a while, I'm going to be sharing a quasi-TBR. It's not an official TBR and it's not all-encompassing, but I thought that this would be a good video to share even more recommendations for spooky reads. Now, these are going to be books that I haven't read yet, so I can't guarantee that they're any good, but they are books that I have heard are quite spooky and that I'm hoping to read in October or November. So I wanted to share those just in case you were looking for even more leads on some spooky, cozy, fall time books. So make sure you stay to the end of the video to see those books that I'm planning or hoping to read in October, get some more recs. But first, I'm going to go through my September stats and review all the books that I finished in September. As always, if you're not a stats person, feel free to skip to the first book review. The chapters at the bottom of the video and in the description box will help you figure out how to navigate this video. But if you are as into numbers and graphs and charts as I am, then grab a cup of tea and join me while we go through the stats. So in September, I finished 11 books with a total of 2,757 pages read. The longest book was A Lesson in Vengeance, and the shortest was When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain. I had 0 DNFs this month. As for the age demographic of the books I finished in September, 72.7% were adult and 27.3% were YA. Moving on to genre. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the most frequently read genres in September for me were fantasy and horror, tied for 3 books each, followed by 2 science fiction novels, a mystery, a romance, and a thriller. Moving on to the format in which I consumed these novels, 54.5% were in audiobook form, 18.2% I read as a physical book, and 27.3% were ebooks. As for my ratings, I had 0 1-star reads, 1 2-star read, 1 3-star read, 6 4-star reads, and 3 5-star reads. Moving on to LGBTQIA+ representation in the books I read in September, 63.6% of the books I read had LGBTQIA+ rep in some form, and 36.4% had no rep. As for the year published, 6 of the books I read were published this year in 2021, and 1 book was published in each of 2020, 2017, 2009, 1959, and 1926. Moving on to how I got the books I read in September, most of my books this month came from the library, 41.7%, 25% were from Scribd, 16.7% were physical books that I own, 8.3% were from Libro.fm, and 8.3% from NetGalley. As for the author's identity, 90.9% were female and 9.1% were male. 54.5% were white, 18.2% were East Asian, and 9.1% were Southeast Asian, 9.1% were Latina, and 9.1% were Black. Looking at the author's nationality, I made a concerted effort in September to try to read a little more broadly, to pick up books from several different areas in the world, because I wasn't happy with the geographic breakdown of the authors I read from in August. So in September, I made an effort, and I'm happy to see it here. 7 of the books I read were written by authors from the United States, which is unsurprising considering how huge the publishing industry is in the United States. But I also read 4 books from other countries in the world, including Argentina, Canada, Poland, and the United Kingdom. And lastly, a stat I don't always include when it's irrelevant, but this month I read a couple translated works. So 81.8% of the books I read in September were written in English originally, and 18.2% were translated into English. So there you go. Those are all my stats for my reads in September. And now my favorite part, let's jump into all the books I read and let me tell you all of my thoughts. So the first book I finished in September was The Dead and the Dark by Courtney Gould. This is a sapphic young adult horror all about the things that go bump in the night on the fringes of a small town. This is a haunting and achingly lonely novel about hatred and prejudice and all of the other evils that fester in the darkness. This novel is really interesting in its dichotomy between this creeping, slithering, oozing unseen evil that seems to be infecting an entire small town, while simultaneously having this core of love and community and family and belonging. And this novel has quite a surprisingly hopeful or uplifting message running throughout, which you don't usually expect with a horror novel. There's also a great enemies to lovers sort of sapphic romance running underneath the story as a subplot between two incredibly lost souls in search of answers and a place to call home. And while that romance isn't the main focus of the story, it's a really lovely element. I would definitely recommend this book. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was really well done, very spooky, very scary, but also, like I said, had that sort of hopeful, loving element included there. I think it explored a lot of interesting themes, which I don't want to go too much into. There's a lot of twists and turns in this one, so I'm always cautious about spoiling anything. But I would definitely recommend it. I gave it 4 stars, with the caveat that you check out trigger warnings. This one could especially be difficult for those of us within the LGBTQIA+ community to read about. There is quite a bit of homophobia, lesbophobia. There are hate crimes and slurs used, so keep that in mind. Our protagonist and her family are all part of the LGBTQIA+ community, and they push back against this behavior. It is very clear that it's not being condoned by the novel, but it could be difficult to read. It could be painful to read, so just keep that in mind. Check out those trigger warnings. The horror of this novel also is centered around children, so if you struggle with violence against children or child death, again, this may be something you want to steer clear of. The next book I finished in September was When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Nghi. And this is the second novella in the Singing Hills cycle, the first of which, The Emperor of Salt and Fortune, I absolutely adored and gave 5 stars. Sadly, the second installment was not quite as exquisite as the first, which just pains me so much to say. And honestly, it's kind of unfair because the first novella is so stunning, so well done, so well paced. Everything is tied together perfectly. The world building, the characterization, the themes, everything is so well balanced and well thought out and poignant that comparing anything to it just feels like a uphill battle. And sadly, this second installment just didn't quite hit that peak of excellence that the first one did. Now, that's not to say that the second novella isn't worth reading. I still really enjoyed it. It was still beautifully written, very fantastical. These novellas read like long lost fairy tales with a very dark streak, and they're really beautiful. I would definitely recommend. But I will say that this one did not quite hit the same as the first. It just felt a little disconnected and removed. The structure is very similar to the first, where we have our main character, Chi, who is a non-binary cleric who travels around gathering stories to record for posterity. And in this novel, Chi's sidekick, Almost Brilliant, who is a talking bird, isn't there. That was the first thing that hurt a little bit because I loved Almost Brilliant and I loved their interactions with each other, and losing that dynamic definitely left a bit of a hole in the outside storyline of this novella. And just like the first, you have that sort of outside present day storyline, and then you have the story within a story, the story that's being told to Chi to record. And in this novel, the ties that bind the story within a story to the framing were a little more tenuous. There wasn't quite the same emotional impact here. It felt a lot more removed. And the messages that were being told just didn't resonate with me as deeply. I just felt there was something missing. I didn't connect to it on the same emotional level as I did the first novel. And while the story itself was fascinating and I was pulled into it and wanted to know what happened, the stakes just didn't feel like they were there. I didn't feel nearly as invested, which is kind of strange because the actual stakes within the framing of this novella are actually quite a bit more dire and time sensitive and potentially fatal than the first. But even though we're told that, that feeling just doesn't really come across. So sadly, this one, it was a little disappointing despite the fact that I gave it 4 stars. I think it was still wonderful, but my expectations were just so high after the first that sadly, this one could not live up to them. Even still, I would recommend you read the second installment if you read The Empress of Salt and Fortune and enjoyed it, but that's just where I'm at. I would love to know in the comments if you've read both first and second novellas in the Singing Hills cycle. What are your thoughts? Which one was your favorite? Do you feel kind of similarly? I'm really sad about it, to be honest. Maybe I just missed something. It's quite short, so maybe I'll try rereading it and just see how it feels. Because I did have to read The Empress of Salt and Fortune twice before I fell in love with it. The first time, I didn't really absorb what was going on. So maybe that happened again. It's possible. The next book I finished in September was my first 5-star read of the month, and that is The Blue Castle by L.M. Montgomery. Now you might recognize the name L.M. Montgomery. She is a very well-known Canadian author who wrote the Anne of Green Gables series, which I read as a child many times. In case you didn't know, Anne of Green Gables is not a single novel. It's a huge series, and it's great. So much nostalgia. I really want to reread it. But anyway, even as a Canadian who grew up reading L.M. Montgomery's work, I had never heard of this novel until recently. And I decided to give it a try because I love Anne of Green Gables so much. And I was really curious to read an adult novel written by L.M. Montgomery instead of novels aimed at children. And when I tell you that this book blew me away, pardon the pun, it was amazing. This is not going to be everyone's cup of tea. This is a pretty slow-paced character study focused on our main character, Valancy, who has just turned 29 and is still unmarried. And at the time that this novel takes place, that means that she is relegated to a life of old maidenhood, and she is sort of a lost cause, and her family views her as essentially a burden for the rest of time that she will live with them and never have a family of her own. And that is seen as pretty much the worst thing that can happen to a woman in this time. Valancy has come to this point in her life, and she very much wants to experience romance. She's never had that spark with someone, and she feels like she's missing out on something. She spends a huge amount of her time daydreaming about her blue castle, where she is beautiful and adored and can have a new lover every week, retreating away from her reality, which is full of family members who are incredibly overbearing and just awful. But she gets some news near the start of the novel that leads her to change her path in life, to have the courage to try something different. And the journey she goes on is just so heartwarming and lovely. She really self-actualizes. She has so much personal growth, and she gets to be who she truly is for the first time. And it's just so, so wonderful to read about. So if you're not a fan of slower-paced, character-driven stories, this may not be for you. It also has copious, stunning descriptions of the natural world where they are, which is in northern Ontario. And those passages talking about the way the light hits the water, or the way the snow blankets the trees, or all of the different types of flora and fauna that live in harmony in the forest together. There are so many amazing nature descriptions. And if I didn't love Valancy so much and being in her head, those would be my favorite part of the novel because they're just stunning. I could just read L.M. Montgomery's descriptions of the natural world for the rest of time and be so happy. But in this book, Valancy as a character and her journey is so charming and relatable and just lovely. I can't think of another word for this book other than lovely. It really, truly is. And somehow, because Valancy is so amazing, I actually loved reading about her journey as a character even more than the nature descriptions, which is kind of incredible because, again, those nature descriptions are just exquisite. So if that sounds like something you'll like, definitely check it out. I just absolutely adored it. It's a new favorite for sure. It's going to become a new comfort read. Definitely. I read it as an ebook, but I'm going to get a hard copy so that I can keep it with me always. The next book I finished in September was The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, a horror classic written in the 1950s. And this is the story of a haunted house and a man who has gathered a ragtag group together, people who have had paranormal experiences in their lives, to stay in this house for a while and try to do experiments and gather observations and try to learn what they can about this haunted house. And I must say that this isn't really what I expected. I definitely enjoyed it. I really enjoy Shirley Jackson's writing style. I've read The Lottery, which is a short story that she wrote, which I thought was just fantastic. And I'm looking forward to reading more Shirley Jackson in the future. So I already knew I liked her writing style, and that continued to be true in The Haunting of Hill House. I will say that the story was not how I expected. It was a lot more slow paced, and it was a lot less scary, I guess, than I expected. And I think this is just the cultural shift between what was considered horror, what was considered scary in the 1950s versus the 2020s. I mean, I am personally not someone who's interested in the sort of slasher genre or horror that goes too far into unnecessary excessive violence and pain. That's usually not my kind of thing. I'm definitely more interested in horror that has a message, or weird, ambiguous horror, psychological horror. Those are all sort of more what I find interesting. And I would say that The Haunting of Hill House definitely falls more into that category, but in a really interesting way. I would say that The Haunting of Hill House feels less like a ghost story and more like a character study of a really lonely woman who has never had the chance to live her own life or find her own happiness or place to belong. And she finds that first spark of joy, that first sense of belonging in Hill House, in a haunted house. That fear and terror of this haunting of the unknown gives her that kick of adrenaline that seems to bring her a huge amount of joy, almost as if she had never truly lived until she came to Hill House. And there's a lot of questions. It's very ambiguous. You don't really know what's happening. Is it actually supernatural? Is there paranormal activity? You never find out. And I think some people dislike that ambiguity. For me, that was the most interesting part of this novel, and really the character study of Eleanor, seeing the way that she was affected by the house and how she affected the house in turn, seeing how she changed during her time in the house and the way that she reacted to the people who were there with her and the choices she made. Absolutely fascinating. I will say that while it was interesting, it wasn't as gripping as I expected. I think the atmosphere was perhaps lacking. As much as you are in a haunted house and all these spooky things are happening, the way that Shirley Jackson wrote this novel sort of continuously dissipated the tension through the dialogue and through the way that the main characters reacted to what was happening to them. So you would have tension start to rise, you would start to feel the hairs go up on the back of your neck, and then Jackson would cut through the tension and it would sort of dissipate. And then it would start to build again, and then you'd have this like really casual or silly dialogue that would sort of cut it again. And while that was sort of interesting, and I did enjoy the levity and comedy of it all, I actually quite enjoyed the dialogue. I just sort of wish that that dialogue had been maybe focused more at the beginning and maybe reduced later in the novel to allow the tension to continue so that you could really start to feel that creeping dread and stress, I guess, that you get usually as you lead towards the end of a novel. The fact that the tension kept coming up and then being dropped down again and up and dropped down again sort of pulled me out of the novel a bit, I guess. So I don't know. I clearly have mixed feelings about this. I did really enjoy it. I would definitely recommend it if you're a horror fan. It is a classic of the genre, but maybe don't expect the kind of horror that you're going to read in new releases for 2021. It is not that. But it is a very interesting character study, and you do end up with a lot of questions that can be very interesting to debate with yourself or with others who have read the book if you're interested in doing that. So I ended up giving The Haunting of Hill House 3 stars. I thought it was well done. I found it very interesting, but it was missing that something that would have really taken it over the edge for me. The next book I finished in September was the biggest disappointment of the lot, and I'm really sad about it. It's Darling by K. Ancrum. Darling is a Peter Pan retelling or Peter Pan inspired young adult horror thriller novel that is taking place in contemporary times. There's no magic going on, and my favorite part about this book was the diverse cast of characters. There are a lot of different types of LGBTQIA plus representation here, and I thought that they were done well, and I enjoyed seeing how naturally they were integrated into these characters. But sadly, that was kind of the only thing I liked about it. Which hurts so much to say because I read The Weight of the Stars by K. Ancrum, I think a couple months back, and it was beautiful. I loved it so much, and it really raised my expectations for anything written by K. Ancrum, and I've heard that so much of Ancrum's work is really amazing. So I was super excited to read Darling. I thought it was going to be a really cool, creepy, contemporary twist on Peter Pan. I was excited, and I guess it was a creepy contemporary twist on Peter Pan, but it felt rushed. It felt kind of empty. It didn't make a lot of sense. You really had to suspend your disbelief many times throughout this quite short novel that takes place in a single night. The pacing, because it takes place in a single night, just feels very strange. Like this night goes on for like a month. So much happens in a single night. It feels unbelievable. And it also just felt like it went to such a dark place without warning, I guess, without justification, without a message, I guess. I'm not sure. I'm sure I'm a very difficult thriller horror reader to please because I don't mind reading about dark things, but I need them to have a clear reason to exist for me to be able to read about them. I don't enjoy reading trauma porn or novels that are extremely violent or gruesome or horrifying just for shock value. I can read those exact same events if they are either based on reality, based on telling someone's true story, or if they exist for a larger purpose within the story, if they are contributing to a larger message. Something within that vein. So that probably makes me very hard to please. And I just felt like Darling didn't have that message. I didn't feel like there was a message. And it was quite dark and disturbing what was happening under the surface. The reveal was quite unsettling, but it didn't feel like it happened for any reason. It was just there to be horrifying. And it just felt like I was subjecting myself to a dark, horrible story for no reason. There was no message. It didn't feel like it went anywhere. I didn't know why I was reading it. I didn't really care about the characters. Yeah, very disappointing. I gave it 2 stars because I do think that there were some interesting nuggets in there. I think this could have been a really interesting novel, but it needed a lot more editing, a lot more direction, maybe just a lot more time. The next book I finished in September was Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. This is a novel that was recently translated from Polish, and it's a bit of a literary mystery where our protagonist is an older woman who lives alone in a relatively remote village in Poland, and she's a bit of a curmudgeon-y old lady. She doesn't like people very much, but she does love animals, and she enjoys astrology, and she loves the poetry of William Blake. And this novel, I believe, was recommended to me by one of you, I think. I'm pretty sure it was a comment on maybe last month's video that someone recommended I read this book. And thank you so much for recommending it because I loved it. I thought it was amazing. I gave it 5 stars. This book really surprised me. I expected it to be a bit of a mystery. It's described as, you know, an old woman who is trying to solve a mystery and no one pays attention because she's an old woman. So she just gets brushed aside. So she decides to sort of investigate on her own. And yes, that part of it is true. And I did really enjoy that part of it. I just think that's a really interesting dynamic. But there's also so much more going on in this novel below the surface. And even above the surface. This novel has so much to say about so many different things, and it was incredibly thought-provoking. I thought it was beautifully written, and I kept pausing the audiobook to quickly type down what was being said because I just felt like there were so many nuggets of wisdom and really interesting turns of phrase that were being used that were just really doing it for me. It was filling my tank. Okay, so thank you to whoever recommended this. It was great. Some of the themes being discussed in this novel are worthiness, whether living beings have inherent value and who determines how much value someone has. But why should we have to be useful, and for what reason? Who divided the world into useless and useful, and by what right? Does a thistle have no right to life, or a mouse that eats the grain in a warehouse? What about bees and drones, weeds and roses? Whose intellect can have had the audacity to judge who is better and who worse? A large tree, crooked and full of holes, survives for centuries without being cut down, because nothing could possibly be made out of it. This example should raise the spirits of people like us. Everyone knows the profit to be reaped from the useful, but nobody knows the benefit to be gained from the useless. There's also discussion of institutions and religion. A favorite quote of mine was, "Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion." There's also quite a bit of discussion about the human condition, and most of all, our treatment of non-human animals. Our protagonist is a huge animal lover. She's a vegetarian, and she feels quite strongly about how non-human animals are treated, and that is a huge part of this book. And I just loved the way that she expressed herself and the way that she talked about animals. It resonated very deeply with me as an ethical vegan of almost a decade, and it's not something I expected going into this book, so it took me by surprise in a very pleasant way. "Its animals show the truth about a country," I said. "Its attitude toward animals. If people behave brutally toward animals, no form of democracy is ever going to help them. In fact, nothing will at all." This novel is award-winning for a reason. I thought it was stunning, so thought-provoking. The main character is really fun to follow, and there's some twists and turns in there that you might not see coming. Quite fascinating, very unique read, and I would definitely recommend it. The next book I finished in September was A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. And this is the first book in the new Monk and Robot series that Chambers is working on. And I really enjoyed this, which is probably a surprise to no one who has watched any of my bookish videos. If you've been around here, you know that I love Becky Chambers. I first discovered her last year, and I have been inhaling all of her work and just loving everything. She writes such heartwarming, character-driven stories that are set within a sci-fi framework, and I really love that. It's very reminiscent of old school Star Trek, which is just my favorite. I love character-driven sci-fi that's focused more on the people within this world and moral questions of rights and how society should progress moving forward and how we treat each other, how we live together, rather than the sci-fi that's more action-heavy and more about cool guns in space. So, as always, I really enjoyed this one. I will say that I think this book may have suffered a bit from being the first in a new series. Quite a bit of time was spent on the setup, on developing our main character, on introducing us to the world and their backstory, and the actual main action of the book, what we are led to believe this book is going to be about, is actually relegated to quite a short amount of time near the end of the novel. And it really did feel like a prequel or a setup for what's to come. And I'm definitely going to keep reading it. I really enjoyed what I did get out of it, but it did feel like it dragged a little bit at times, which is just something to keep in mind. I did really enjoy what we did get, though. I did really like the characters that we were introduced to, and I hope that in future books we'll get to see more of the world and learn more about what happened and what led to the world being the way that it is when this series started. The next book I finished in September was Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Bazterrica. And this is the other translated work I read in September. The author is from Argentina, and this was translated to English. If you don't know what this book is about, let me just warn you before we get into the discussion. I will put the book card up now so you can see the trigger warnings. I am going to be discussing cannibalism in this review, at least in passing. So if that's something that you don't even want to hear about within the context of a review, definitely skip to the next book. But if you're okay to hear the review, I'm not going to go into any gory details, of course, then hang out with me a little longer. So if you're still here after that warning, Tender as the Flesh is the story of our world after a plague has swept through the non-human animals and killed off the vast majority of them. Because of the loss of so many of the animals treated as livestock and as food, humanity has shifted to eat other humans, and they have started to raise humans as livestock to be eaten. As you might expect, Tender is the Flesh is quite the disturbing read, though I will say not quite as disturbing as I expected. I actually thought I wasn't going to be able to read this book. I heard about it and thought it sounded really interesting, but I thought it would be far too gruesome for me and that I wouldn't be able to handle the gore I imagined would be contained within its pages. And it does contain quite a bit of body horror, gore, and yet it was a lot less disturbing than I expected it to be. It almost felt mundane, which makes me sound mildly terrifying, but let me explain. As I mentioned when talking about Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, I am a longtime vegan. I've been vegan for almost a decade, and I went vegan because I saw videos of slaughterhouses and factory farms and even non-factory farms, regular farms, and saw how the animals were treated, and I found that so horrific, disgusting, upsetting that I stopped eating meat and shortly after stopped eating any animal products and have never gone back. So that caveat I think is important. I've seen footage of what this book is talking about. And the things that are described in this book are not extreme over-exaggerations of how we treat non-human animals. This is exactly how non-human animals are treated every single day to provide the meat on human beings' plates. And while, yeah, there's an extra level of horror involved when the animals that are being treated this way are fellow human beings, I already see non-human animals as a lot more similar to us than I think the average person does. I think most ethical vegans would agree that most people don't view non-human animals as anywhere near on par with human beings, and that's just not my worldview at all. I think that animals have as much of a right to life and as much of a right to not be horrifically tortured and abused throughout the life that they do have. And I know that that's not a commonly held belief, but it is the one that I've had for the past 10 years of my life. So that context included here. I wasn't shocked by anything I read in this novel. Sure, there's an added level of discomfort that it's human beings that this is happening to, but none of the things that happen to them are out of the norm. These things happen every single day, and I know they happen. I've seen footage of these horrors. I am more than aware of the reality of how we treat animals we have decided don't have rights. Animals we've arbitrarily put into the category of object, consumable, property, livestock. We attempt to strip these animals of their identity, of their sentience, of their rights and feelings and experiences. We make arbitrary distinctions in our mind between animals that we love and treat as companions as part of the family, and animals that we are free to abuse and torture and kill for our own pleasure. And as this book points out, that distinction is absolutely meaningless. The humans in this book who are doing the consuming and the humans in this book who are being consumed are not different from each other in any fundamental way. They are all part of the same human race. They're all the same species. They all have the same potential. They should all have the same rights. And yet they don't. There is this completely arbitrary, meaningless distinction to split the humans from the heads, as they call them, from the special meat, as they call it. No one can call them humans because that would mean giving them an identity. They call them product, or meat, or food. Except for him, he would prefer not to have to call them by any name. This is a very graphic way of taking a reader and forcing them to confront their own cognitive dissonance, and I found it absolutely fascinating. Will this book be for everyone? Definitely not. But I am curious to know if those who do read this novel find themselves a little more willing to consider a more compassionate lifestyle and to extend the level of horror that they felt for the human beings in this story to encompass the livestock we currently treat in these horrific ways. It's hard to know if this book will have any kind of effect, but it was definitely interesting to read through that lens. There's definitely many other layers to this book, including misinformation, propaganda, class divisions, hierarchies, the harms of capitalism. There's a lot in here, but it was very difficult for me to read this from any other major framework other than that of animal rights, because it is so clearly a commentary on how we treat the animals that we have put into the category of food, and how the way we treat them is really goddamn horrific. So that's Tender as the Flesh. Definitely a very graphic, very gruesome book. You have been warned. But I am very curious to hear your thoughts if any of you have read Tender as the Flesh, especially different perspectives, whether you are vegan or vegetarian or you're a meat eater. How did you feel about the novel? Did it make you think about the way that we treat and consume animals in a different way? Did you get something completely different from it? Did you come at it from a different framework? I'm really curious because I think this book, as dark and depressing and horrifying as it is, it has a lot of interesting things to say, and I think it can spark some really fascinating discussion. So leave your comments down below if you've read Tender as the Flesh. I am really, really curious to hear your thoughts. The next book I finished in September was Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, and this was our book club read for September. And this is the story of Klara, a solar-powered robot with artificial intelligence who has been created to be a companion for a child. And Klara is a really fascinating protagonist. It is really interesting to take in this novel from her point of view. She's an artificial intelligence, and she's still learning a lot about the world and how humans work and how to interact with them. And it's really interesting to see the conclusions that she comes to in observing the world around her. She also develops essentially a religion around the sun, which is the direct source of her life, of her power. And the way that her faith is woven in throughout the story is really, really interesting, especially as an atheist to read. And I felt like that faith was there as an indication that Klara was in fact sentient, that she had a consciousness, that she was a person, that she was able to make these leaps and sort of create her own religion based on her observations of the world and her understanding of how she is able to survive. Now, there are definitely some things that I wasn't a huge fan of in this novel. There were some threads that were kind of left dangling. There were some areas where I really had to suspend disbelief. And there was one sort of big choice near the end that I didn't really understand. And as we touched on in our book club discussion, I would have loved to see things go another direction, because I think it would have brought up a lot more questions and really just been the more interesting path. But it didn't go that way. So this book was not perfect by any means, but I found it fascinating, and that's coming from someone who really finds artificial intelligence very interesting. I love that debate about what constitutes a human being, what gives someone that something that makes them a person. When does an artificial intelligence become a person? They're never going to be a human being, but do they have consciousness? Do they have a soul? Do souls exist? Do they have that spark that makes them an individual? Do they have a right to life? Should they have rights as people? Any media that explores these discussions, I just find absolutely fascinating. It's a topic that comes up over and over again in Star Trek, especially when it comes to Data and the Doctor in Voyager. It's also sort of the main storyline, the main message of the video game Detroit Become Human, which I really enjoyed. So I was really happy to have this conversation again. I'm always interested to hear about how different people conceptualize artificial intelligence and how they fit into our understanding of life and consciousness and sentience. Just fascinating. There were definitely some parts of this book that weren't my favorite, many of the characters, in fact, but Again, the discussion that was being had and Klara herself, fascinating. I really enjoyed it. The next book I finished in September was A Lesson in Vengeance by Victoria Lee. This is a dark academia, young adult, horror thriller novel that takes place at a prep school founded by a survivor of the Salem witch trials. And this is a super spooky novel that went in a direction that I didn't expect. And I think that this is actually a lot darker than you would expect to see from a horror or thriller within the young adult demographic. A Lesson in Vengeance is very dark and twisted. There are witches, ghosts, lies, murder, rituals, seances, the whole 9 yards. The atmosphere is wonderful. If you are into dark academia, if you love the old bookish vibes, this will definitely fulfill that need for you. We have an unreliable narrator who is suffering from psychotic depression. I love how uncertain this book is. I love that we never really know if what Felicity is experiencing is really happening or if she is telling her own story as a way to protect herself from reality. We never really know if there is some sort of paranormal element or if this is all the doing of flesh and blood human beings. I also really appreciated the discussions of the way that the witch trials were used to control women and to punish women who tried to step out of the bounds of what was considered appropriate or feminine, for women who were difficult, who had new ideas, who were independent, or had interests that were considered unsavory or unladylike. That accusations that someone is a witch or that they are possessed have been used against women for centuries. And that link between the Salem witch trials and feminism in sexism and misogyny is fascinating. And I really enjoyed those threads that continued on throughout the story. We also have LGBTQIA plus representation with our main character, Felicity, who is a lesbian, and a side character who is non-binary. This is a very spooky read. I would consider it kind of a combination of horror and psychological thriller with a little bit of paranormal sprinkled on top. Very, very much dark academia vibes. So I would recommend this if you're looking for a spooky read for October. The last book I finished in September was The Tangleroot Palace by Marjorie Liu. And I was actually provided the audiobook of The Tangleroot Palace by NetGalley for review. And I ended up purchasing the physical copy because I got about halfway through and I loved so many of the stories. This is a short story collection, and I ended up listening to the audiobook simultaneously while reading it. And this is an amazing short story collection. I have never read anything by Marjorie Liu before, but I certainly will be reading more of her work because this was just fantastic. These short stories are all within the fantasy genre, and they all have a horror, mystery, fairy tale vibe to them, making this just such a perfect short story collection to read in the fall. Very spooky. You can pick out one at a time and read them throughout the month, throughout the season. I would highly recommend this. All 7 stories are great, but my absolute favorites were Sympathy for the Bones, The Briar and the Rose, and The Last Dignity of Man. They're all amazing though. I would so highly recommend this book. Also the cover, I mean, look at it. It's so stunning. I just can't get over it. Anyway, this is great. Definitely recommend. Amazing for spooky season. Like I said, they're all very dark, fairy tale, fantasy vibes. 2 of my favorite stories in this have LGBTQIA plus representation. The Briar and the Rose has a sapphic relationship. And then The Last Dignity of Man has a gay man as our protagonist. It's so good. Y'all, you have to read it. If you love fairy tale, fantasy, short stories, just read it. It's so good, so spooky, perfect for this season. And with that, we have come to the end of the books I read in September. Those are all 11 books I finished. Let me know in the comments down below, of course, if you've read any of these books. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you're planning on reading any of the ones I mentioned, if you've added any to your TBR, I would love to know which ones caught your attention. And now, for this extra little end segment in this video, I do want to share some of the books that I'm hoping to read in October. Just a couple more spooky read ideas in case you, like me, really want all the spooky, cozy, mystery, dark vibes for October. So first of all, we have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. A very spooky premise with this one, a classic, of course. And I love Oscar Wilde's work, but I've never read this book. So this has been on my TBR for forever, and I really want to read it in October. Also, a great pick for October is our book club read for the month, which is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, a classic of the sci-fi genre with, of course, some sort of horror vibes to it. Just like The Picture of Dorian Gray, I have never read this, but it has been on my TBR for ages, so I am so excited to read it and to discuss it with my book club. Another spooky classic I want to read in October is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Yet again, very well known to be dark and spooky, something that's been on my TBR for forever, and I'm excited. I'm also probably not going to read all of them, but I would love to dip into this collection of Grimm's fairy tales, just read a few here and there. These are the original tales, and of course the originals are much spookier than the more modernized versions, so I'm definitely gonna dip in and out of this collection and read some of these super spooky fairy tales. Another one that I'm probably just going to dip into and not read the whole thing, because this is huge, is The Complete Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I purchased this collection after we moved, and I've always wanted to read all of these Sherlock Holmes stories, and this weighs a ton. Again, not going to read the whole thing, but I might read a couple of the stories. I've always loved film and TV adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, but I've never read any of the stories. And I feel like October is the perfect month to remedy that. Yet another classic that I'm hoping to read in October, or at least in the fall at some point, is Wuthering Heights. This definitely has some spooky horror elements to it, I have heard. And I've never read Wuthering Heights, but I recently purchased this absolutely stunning edition by LitJoy that is just so beautiful. I can't get over it. If you follow me on Instagram or TikTok, you will know I've been sharing pictures and videos of it since I got it because I just can't get over how pretty it is. But this is definitely one that I'm hoping to read in October for spooky season. Since I started with my physical TBR, I guess I'll just finish that off with my two contemporary spooky novels I'm hoping to get to soon, which are In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead and My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. I have read Stephen Graham Jones before, so I kind of have an idea what I'm in for, but I have heard good things, and I know almost nothing about this one, except that it is apparently an addictive and riveting psychological thriller, and I liked the cover, so I bought it. So I'm gonna read it. I think those are all the physical books that I have that I'm hoping to read during spooky season. So a couple more that'll pop up on the screen that I don't have physically, but I am hoping to read soon. Certain Dark Things by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, White Smoke by Tiffany D. Jackson, All's Well by Mona Awad, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. If you've read any of these books that I just listed, let me know in the comments what you thought of them. That will help me prioritize where I should start because I have quite the little spooky TBR going here. And if you have any other recommendations for me, please let me know. I'm going to quickly pop up on the screen some more recommendations I have of books that I've read in the past that I think are really good picks for spooky season. So these are just books that I've read over the last couple of years that have a really spooky atmosphere or are scary or have dark academia vibes, all of the good things. Just some bonus recommendations for you if you made it all the way to the end of this video. If you did make it to the end, leave a book emoji in the comments so I know you're a real one. Thank you for hanging out with me yet again. One of my favorite things in the world is talking about books with other people who love books. It's just the best. So thank you for enabling my book habit. It's deeply appreciated. I want to take a moment to thank my patrons for their support, because they're the best. Extra special thanks to our newest patrons, P. Kitty, Annette, Becky, Deborah, Annie, Tony, and Morgan. Welcome all of you to the squad. We are so excited to have you. If you at home want to join the squad or join the book club to read Frankenstein with us in October, check out the link in the card and in the description box down below. We would love to have you. And with that, I'm gonna get going. Thank you so much for watching this video and for hanging out with me, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.